The evening air was crisp in Chicago as Bishop Robert Barron stepped out of the cathedral. The golden glow of the setting sun brushed the edges of the stained glass windows, casting colored reflections on the cold stone. He had just finished a deeply moving homily on compassion and divine mercy, and as he walked down the stone steps, he felt a sense of peace. His driver waited by the car, but something made Robert pause. He often talked about the importance of seeing Christ in the poor, in the broken, in the forgotten. That evening, he wanted to walk, just a few blocks. He told his driver he'd catch up later, wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck, and began moving down the street. Downtown Chicago had changed over the years, but certain corners held memories. He passed by the diner where he and his childhood friends would buy fries with spare change after baseball practice. It was boarded up now. Then, just before the underpass near Michigan Avenue, he saw something that made him stop. A man was sitting on a bench, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing. His beard was long and tangled, his face weathered, and he held a cardboard sign that simply read, "God bless." That in itself wasn't unusual, but something about the man's eyes, sharp, hazel, and strangely familiar, stirred something deep in Robert's soul. He stepped closer, carefully, his boots crunching over dry leaves. The man looked up. Their eyes met. "Jimmy?" Robert asked softly, his breath catching. The man squinted. "Bobby?" The voice was hoarse but unmistakable. It was him, James O'Malley, his best friend from childhood, the boy he used to race bicycles with through the alleys, the one who gave him his first real Bible when they were 12, the one who disappeared after high school. Now he sat on a freezing bench, homeless and alone. For a moment, neither of them moved. The busy city carried on around them, horns honking, people rushing by, but they were suspended in stillness. Robert slowly sat beside him. "What happened to you?" Jimmy gave a weak smile. "Life took a few turns, not all of them good." Robert couldn't believe it. His friend had been one of the smartest in school, full of potential, dreams, kindness. "Why didn't you reach out? I would have—" "I couldn't," Jimmy interrupted. "You were rising. You were becoming someone. And me? I was falling apart." Robert looked down, heart aching. "No one is ever too far to reach." Jimmy coughed, hiding it behind a torn glove. "Been out here 3 years. Got laid off, lost the apartment, then the car, then everything else. Tried shelters, tried to stay sober. It's a long story." Robert turned to face him fully. "Then tell me, I have time." Jimmy laughed bitterly. "I doubt you have time, Bishop." But Robert didn't move. And after a long pause, Jimmy started talking. He spoke of losing his job at the shipping yard, about how one injury snowballed into prescription pills, then stronger substances, how his family turned away, how shame built walls too tall to climb. He cried when he mentioned missing his mother's funeral because he had no phone, no way of knowing. He shared how every day was a battle against the cold, hunger, loneliness, and sometimes hope. Robert listened, not as a bishop, but as Bobby, the kid who used to build tree houses with this man, the friend who once promised they'd always look out for each other. When Jimmy finished, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Anyway, that's my story. I'm nobody now. Just another guy on a bench." Robert was silent for a long moment, heart heavy with emotion. Then he stood. "You're coming with me." Jimmy looked up, startled. "What? You're not staying here tonight? Or tomorrow? Or any night? Not anymore?" Jimmy shook his head. "I don't want pity. It's not pity. It's love. And it's long overdue." Jimmy hesitated. "I smell like hell. Haven't showered in weeks. Haven't eaten in 2 days." Robert smiled gently. "Then let's fix that." He took out his phone and called his driver. As they waited, Robert took off his scarf and wrapped it around Jimmy's neck. Then he gave him his gloves. People walking by stared. Some even took photos. But Robert didn't care. This wasn't a photo op. This was redemption in motion. When the car arrived, the driver's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Jimmy, but Robert simply nodded. "Home," he said. "Prepare the guest room." Jimmy sat awkwardly in the plush leather seat, clearly overwhelmed. As the car pulled away, he muttered, "I don't deserve this." Robert looked at him and whispered, None of us do. That's why it's grace." They rode in silence for a while, the city lights passing like fleeting memories. And in that car, something shifted. Not just in Jimmy, but in Robert, too. He had preached countless sermons on mercy, compassion, and the prodigal son. But this was different. This was the gospel, lived, and as the car disappeared into the distance, the bench remained behind, empty for the first time in 3 years. The car arrived at Bishop Robert Barron's residence, a modest but beautiful home on the outskirts of Chicago, not far from the seminary where he taught theology. Jimmy looked out the tinted windows, eyes wide, uncertain, a mix of shame and awe stirring in him. As they pulled into the driveway, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, hands clenched into fists in his lap. Robert noticed. "You don't have to be afraid. You're safe now." Jimmy didn't reply. The last place he had called home was a cardboard shelter beneath an overpass. Now he was being ushered into a bishop's house. It felt like stepping into another dimension. The driver opened the door, and Robert helped Jimmy out. A staff member met them at the door, her face revealing confusion at the unexpected guest. But Robert offered a quiet look that silenced any questions. "Please prepare the guest room," he said gently. "We'll need food, towels, and clothes. Warm clothes." Jimmy tried to protest. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Robert said. "You're my friend." Inside, the warmth hit Jimmy like a wave. The smell of pine and aged wood filled the air. A fire crackled softly in the hearth. Religious paintings lined the walls. Jesus walking on water, the prodigal son returning home, Mary weeping with open arms. Jimmy stared at each one as if they were whispering truths he had long forgotten. Robert guided him to the kitchen. "Sit. You need food." Jimmy sat, still stiff and uncertain, while Robert opened the fridge and began pulling out leftovers: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, soup. He moved with the grace of a man used to serving others, not expecting anything in return. When the plate was set in front of him, Jimmy looked at it like it was a mirage. "Go ahead," Robert urged. The first bite was slow, the second faster. By the third, Jimmy was eating like a man who hadn't had a proper meal in weeks, which was true. Robert sat across from him, watching silently, occasionally sipping tea. When Jimmy finally slowed down, he wiped his mouth and looked up, eyes misty. "You still pray before meals?" "I pray during them too." Robert smiled. "Gratitude doesn't end at amen." Jimmy laughed, the first real laugh in ages. "You always were a preacher. And you always were the one who asked the tough questions. You remember that time in 6th grade when you asked Father Donnelly why hell had fire if spirits don't have bodies?" Jimmy chuckled. "I do. He made me stand in the hallway for being a heretic." They both laughed now, and for a moment, they weren't a bishop and a homeless man. They were just Bobby and Jimmy, kids from the neighborhood who used to share comic books and bike tricks. Later, after Jimmy had showered and changed into clean clothes, Robert brought him to the guest room. It was simple. White sheets, a wooden crucifix on the wall, a small lamp beside the bed. Jimmy stood at the door, overwhelmed. "I don't know if I can sleep in a bed again," he admitted quietly. "You'll be surprised how quickly comfort can return," Robert said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jimmy turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" Robert took a deep breath. "Because Christ lives in you. Because you're my brother, and because I made a vow to live what I preach. Tonight, that means seeing you not as a problem to be fixed, but as a soul to be embraced." Jimmy's voice cracked. "But I've failed, over and over." "So have I," Robert said gently. "So has everyone who ever walked this earth, except one. That's why we don't give up. That's why we keep walking." Jimmy nodded slowly and stepped into the room. Robert lingered a moment, then turned to leave. Just before he closed the door, he heard Jimmy whisper, "Thank you." That night, Robert lay in bed, unable to sleep. Memories of their childhood floated through his mind. The time they skipped school to watch a Cubs game, the way Jimmy cried when his dog died, the way they built forts in the woods and swore they'd become priests together. He wondered how many other Jimmys were out there, lost, forgotten, hiding in plain sight. And what good was preaching from a pulpit if those sermons never touched the streets? The next morning, Robert found Jimmy already awake, sitting quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He had shaved and combed his hair. His eyes were clearer, though still tired. "Morning," Robert said. "Morning," Jimmy replied. "I couldn't sleep much. Too quiet." Robert smiled. "You'll adjust." Jimmy looked at him seriously. "What now? I mean, you're not going to keep me here forever." "No," Robert said, "but I'm going to help you find your footing, a place to live, a way to rebuild." Jimmy shook his head. "You can't fix me. I'm not trying to fix you. I'm walking with you." Later that day, Robert made a few calls to friends who ran shelters, recovery programs, housing ministries. He pulled every string he could, not because Jimmy was a special case, but because he was family. That's how Robert had come to see every person in need, an extension of the family of God. Word quickly began to spread. Bishop Barron had taken a homeless man into his home. Some were moved, others were skeptical. A few criticized him, saying it was irresponsible, even dangerous. But Robert didn't flinch. At Mass the following Sunday, he addressed it openly. "There are many of you who wonder what I'm doing," he said from the pulpit. "Let me be clear. I am not saving a man. I am recognizing Christ in a man. And if that unsettles you, then perhaps the gospel should unsettle us more often." Jimmy sat in the back pew of the cathedral that Sunday morning, his hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the marble floor. He wore the only decent suit Robert had found in the rectory's donation closet, slightly too large but clean. His hair was combed back, and though his shoes were worn, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that hadn't been there days ago. When Robert spoke those words from the pulpit, "I am not saving a man, I am recognizing Christ in a man," Jimmy felt a lump rise in his throat. It had been years since he stepped foot inside a church, even longer since he believed he belonged in one. But now, with the bishop speaking not just about him, but to him, something cracked open deep inside. The congregation was silent. You could almost hear hearts shifting. After Mass, people approached. Some were curious, others cautious. A few offered handshakes. A woman with 2 children smiled warmly at Jimmy and pressed a folded bill into his palm. "For you," she said. "To start again." He tried to refuse, but she insisted. "Take it, please." Jimmy looked at Robert. "I don't know what's happening." Robert smiled. "It's mercy. Just accept it." That afternoon, they sat on the back porch of the bishop's house. The trees were bare, and the wind carried the promise of early snow. But the sun was bright. Robert poured 2 mugs of hot cider and handed one to Jimmy. "I talked to a friend at the St. Augustine Center," Robert said. "They have a spot open in their transitional housing program. It's a room, a bed, food, support." Jimmy looked down. "I don't want to take someone else's place." "You're not. It's yours if you want it." Jimmy took a sip of cider, then stared into the distance. "It's just, I'm afraid I'll mess it up, that I'll get in, stay for a few weeks, then crash again. I've done it before. I don't trust myself." Robert leaned forward. "Then lean on the ones who do trust you. You don't have to walk this alone." There was a long silence between them. Then Jimmy nodded. "Okay, I'll try." Robert reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather Bible. "You gave me my first Bible, remember? When we were kids." Jimmy smiled faintly. "Of course. It had a green cover. You left it out in the rain." "I still have it," Robert said. "And now, I want to give you this one. Let it remind you of who you are, not just where you've been." Jimmy held the Bible with trembling hands. "Thank you." The next day, Robert drove him to the St. Augustine Center. The building was simple but welcoming. Inside, volunteers were bustling about, serving lunch, folding clothes, offering warm greetings. A man named Curtis, a former addict turned counselor, welcomed Jimmy with a firm handshake. "Welcome home," he said. Robert stayed for a while, helped carry in Jimmy's few belongings, a duffel bag, the Bible, and a scarf Robert had given him. Before leaving, he hugged Jimmy tightly. "This isn't goodbye," Robert said. "It's just the next step." Jimmy nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you for not walking past me." Robert replied, "Thank you for letting yourself be seen." Back at the cathedral, Robert resumed his duties. but something had shifted in him. He began walking more, talking more with people on the streets. He opened up the church basement as a warming shelter. Parishioners volunteered to bring blankets and serve hot meals. Soon, what had started as a simple act of kindness became a ripple effect across the diocese. News spread further. A few media outlets picked up the story. Bishop brings homeless friend back from the brink. Cameras began showing up at Mass. Reporters asked for interviews. Robert gave one, on the condition that the focus remain not on him, but on the greater message. He sat in front of a plain backdrop, hands folded, eyes steady. "This isn't about charity," he told the reporter. "It's about justice. It's about seeing Christ in the places we least expect him. My friend wasn't lost, he was just unseen. We need to start seeing again." The interview went viral. Jimmy watched it on a borrowed phone in the shelter's common room. When he saw Robert speak about him not with pity but with pride, he wept. The other men in the center, many of them hardened by years of pain, offered silent nods of respect. One said, "You're lucky, man. You got someone in your corner." Jimmy replied, "Yeah, I really do." That week, he started attending group therapy. At first, he barely spoke, but slowly, the walls began to fall. He shared about the pain of watching his life unravel, about the shame that clung to him like a second skin, about the miracle of being found again by someone who never forgot him. He began writing too, journaling every day, poems, prayers, memories. The center staff encouraged him to speak at meetings, and soon, Jimmy became a voice of encouragement for others. His story wasn't just one of survival, but of resurrection. Meanwhile, Robert continued his ministry with renewed conviction. He began integrating more real-life stories into his homilies, stories of men and women who had been broken but were being restored. He spoke not just of faith, but of action, not just of belief, but of presence. He and Jimmy met weekly for coffee. Sometimes they'd laugh about old times. Sometimes they'd sit in silence. But always there was a quiet bond between them, a bridge between the past and the present. One snowy evening, Jimmy looked out the window of the center's library and whispered to himself, "I'm not who I was, and I'm not done yet." Winter deepened its grip on Chicago, blanketing the city in layers of white. Icy winds howled through alleyways and across bridges, but inside the St. Augustine Center, warmth bloomed in small, persistent ways. A heater hummed softly in the corner of the library, where Jimmy now spent most of his evenings reading, journaling, and sometimes just staring at the crucifix on the wall in silence. One night, as the snow thickened outside, he was startled by a knock on the library door. It opened slowly, and Robert stepped in, brushing flakes off his coat. "I brought something," he said, holding up a folder. Jimmy closed his journal and sat up. "You always bring something." Robert smiled. "You used to say that when I showed up to our baseball games with snacks. That was different. Back then it was candy and soda. Now it's paperwork." "Important paperwork," Robert said, handing him the folder. "Job applications. A few opportunities I think you'd be great for." Jimmy hesitated. "I haven't worked in 5 years." "You haven't had the chance to work in 5 years. That's different." He opened the folder slowly. There were applications for janitorial work at a local Catholic school, a warehouse position, and a part-time role at a non-profit bookstore. Simple jobs, honest work. "I don't know if I'm ready," Jimmy said quietly. Robert pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Do you remember when we were kids and you jumped into the deep end at MacArthur Pool, even though you didn't know how to swim?" Jimmy laughed softly. "I sank like a rock." "And then?" Robert asked. "You pulled me out." Robert nodded. "And you didn't give up. You learned to swim. You're not starting from nothing, Jimmy. You're starting from healing." They talked for over an hour that night, about work, self-worth, and the fear of failing again. Robert never preached. He just listened, encouraged, affirmed. A few days later, Jimmy submitted his application to the bookstore. Weeks passed. He was called in for an interview. He wore the same oversized suit he'd worn to church, this time with a borrowed tie. He shook hands with the director, answered questions, and even laughed at himself when he knocked over a stack of books. When he got the call 2 days later offering him the job, he sat in stunned silence before whispering, "Thank you, God." He called Robert immediately. "You were right," he said. Robert replied, "I just reminded you of who you already were." The bookstore was small, cozy, and filled with the scent of old pages and coffee. Jimmy started by shelving donations and organizing reading events. He worked quietly, diligently. Every paycheck felt like a small miracle. He used the first one to buy himself new shoes. The second went into savings. On his lunch breaks, he read books on theology, philosophy, poetry. He started attending evening classes at the shelter, learning budgeting, computer skills, and even basic public speaking. The center's staff began asking him to speak at events, to share his story, not as a warning, but as a witness. One Saturday morning, Jimmy stood in front of a room full of volunteers and donors. He wore a clean button-up shirt and spoke without notes. "There was a time I lived under an overpass," he began, "and I didn't think anyone even saw me. I didn't care if they did. I thought I was done. But one person did see me, not just with his eyes, but with his heart." He looked out into the audience, eyes locking briefly with Robert, who sat in the front row. He sat beside me on a bench in the cold and listened. That was the start of everything changing. And I'm not telling you this to make you feel inspired. I'm telling you because there are thousands more just like me, still out there, waiting to be seen, waiting for someone to sit beside them. The room was silent, moved. A few people wiped their eyes, others nodded. Afterward, a young woman approached him. "My brother's homeless," she said. "I gave up on him, but maybe I shouldn't have." Jimmy placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "It's never too late." That night, Robert invited him to dinner with a group of local faith leaders, priests, pastors, community organizers. Jimmy was nervous but curious. They sat around a long wooden table, sharing bread and stories. When Jimmy spoke, everyone listened, not because he was eloquent, but because he was real, raw, redeemed. Afterward, one of the priests turned to Robert. "You didn't just help him, you helped us. We forget sometimes what ministry looks like." Robert said nothing. He simply smiled at Jimmy. Later that week, a letter arrived at the cathedral. It was handwritten, addressed to the bishop who sat on the bench. Robert opened it slowly. "Dear Bishop Barron," it read, "I don't know you. I only know what you did for your friend. I watched the interview. I read the article. And I cried. Because my brother's on this street. I haven't talked to him in 5 years. But after seeing what you did, I went looking for him. I found him. He's in rehab now. I just wanted to say thank you for reminding me that love still works." Robert folded the letter and placed it in his Bible. He knew now this wasn't just about Jimmy. It never had been. It was about the ripple effect of grace. How one act of presence could echo through families, cities, souls. And Jimmy, once invisible, was now a vessel of that echo. Months passed, and spring began to thaw the icy grip of winter. Trees blossomed across the city, and with them so did Jimmy. He walked differently now, head high, shoulders back. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Each morning he arrived at the bookstore early, sweeping the steps and unlocking the doors. Regulars came to know him by name. Children smiled at him during story time. Local teachers invited him to speak to students about resilience. He still lived at the St. Augustine Center, but his counselor had told him he was nearly ready to transition into independent housing. It felt surreal. One morning, as Jimmy sorted through a donation box of books, he found something that made him pause. It was a worn copy of the Bible, its edges frayed, the pages full of underlined verses and handwritten notes. Inside the front cover, there was a name, Bobby Barron. Jimmy stared at it, heart pounding. It couldn't be. He flipped through the pages. Yes, there were notes written in Robert's handwriting, questions scrawled in the margins, tiny stars next to favorite verses. It was the Bible, the one Jimmy had given him decades ago, the one Robert had thought he lost to the rain. How had it found its way here? He brought it to Robert that afternoon, placing it on his desk without a word. Robert looked up, stunned. "Where did you find this?" Jimmy smiled. "Donation box, back corner of the store." Robert opened the cover, touching the pages like they were sacred relics. "I thought I lost this when we were 13. You remember that storm?" Jimmy nodded. "I do. I cried more over that Bible than I did when my bike got stolen." Robert laughed. "And I never stopped looking for it. I replaced it, sure, but this one mattered." He paused, then looked at Jimmy. "You gave me my first Bible, and now it's found its way back, just like you." Jimmy sat down. "Crazy, isn't it? How things come full circle." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Or maybe it's not crazy at all. Maybe grace just knows how to find its way home." That evening, Jimmy took the Bible back with him to the center. He placed it on the small nightstand next to his bed. Before sleeping, he opened it and read one of the verses Robert had marked as a boy. "I once was lost, but now am found." It struck him like a lightning bolt. He had sung those words 100 times in church growing up, but now they felt like his own story. The next week, the center held its annual benefit gala, and Jimmy was asked to speak as the keynote guest. The event was held at a banquet hall, filled with donors, clergy, volunteers, and public officials. There were chandeliers overhead and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. Jimmy had never worn a tuxedo before, but the staff insisted. It was time he saw himself the way others were starting to see him. Robert attended, of course, standing quietly in the back, not to draw attention. He watched as Jimmy took the stage and approached the microphone. Jimmy cleared his throat. "Good evening. My name is James O'Malley. Some of you know me as Jimmy. A year ago, I was sleeping under a bench near Michigan Avenue. Today, I'm here, speaking to you, because one person didn't walk past me. He stopped. He listened. He remembered. He paused, glancing toward Robert. And I know many of you give money, time, and resources to help people like me. But tonight, I want to challenge you to give something else. Presence. Give your ears, your time, your heart, because sometimes that's all a person needs to come back to life." The room erupted in applause. Robert felt his eyes water, pride swelling in his chest, not pride in his own actions, but in witnessing someone reclaim their soul. After the event, Jimmy walked over to Robert, a small plate of cheesecake in his hand. "Still don't like public speaking," he muttered. "You fooled everyone," Robert said, clapping him on the back. That was powerful. Jimmy looked around the room, people shaking hands, writing checks, exchanging stories. "You know, I used to think this world didn't have a place for me anymore." Robert replied, "It didn't, until you made one." That night, Jimmy returned to the shelter and found an envelope on his bed. Inside was a lease agreement, a small studio apartment in the city, subsidized, clean, and his if he wanted it. He stood staring at the papers for a long time. A home, not a cot or a bench. A home. He signed the lease the next morning. When Robert helped him move in, they stood in the middle of the tiny apartment. Bare walls, a single window, a small kitchenette. Jimmy looked around, overwhelmed. "It's not much," he said. Robert smiled. "It's yours. That's what makes it enough." Jimmy sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the quilt a volunteer had gifted him. "I don't know what to say." "You already said it," Robert replied. "When you didn't give up." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Jimmy said, "I want to help others, like me. I don't know how yet, but I want to be that person on the bench next time, the one who sees." Robert nodded slowly. "Then that's your calling." And in that tiny room, with nothing but a suitcase, a donated Bible, and a window facing the sky, Jimmy O'Malley began again, not as a man in need, but as a man of purpose. Jimmy's new apartment was small, but it quickly became a sanctuary. He found joy in the simplest things: a hot cup of coffee in the morning, the creak of the floor under his feet, sunlight spilling through the curtains. Every sound, every smell, every moment was a reminder. He had made it. He hung the Bible Robert had given him on a small shelf beside his bed, right next to a framed photo someone had snapped of the two of them at the benefit gala. Jimmy, in his tuxedo, smiling like he had never smiled before. Robert, with his arm around his shoulder, beaming with quiet pride. Jimmy kept working at the bookstore, but he began to volunteer on weekends at the shelter. At first, he just swept floors, served soup, folded laundry. But then someone asked him if he could lead the Tuesday night reflection group. He hesitated. "I'm not a preacher." "You don't need to be," the staff member said. "Just be real." So he did. He started by telling his story. Not the version that made headlines, but the raw one. The nights he shivered under overpasses, the times he relapsed, the moments he thought of ending it all, but also the moment a bishop sat beside him without judgment, the moment grace cracked through his shame. People listened. Men who had built walls with their pain started nodding. Some cried. Some stayed after to talk. Soon those groups grew. One night Robert slipped into the back of the room without announcing himself. He sat silently, listening to Jimmy share about the day he found his old Bible again. How that moment reminded him that God never truly loses anything. "I thought I was trash," Jimmy said. "But God doesn't make trash. He makes stories, and mine isn't over yet." Robert felt his throat tighten. He had preached thousands of sermons, but none had struck him like this. After the session, he approached Jimmy outside. "You were born to do this," Robert said. Jimmy shook his head. "I was born to survive. This is a bonus," Robert smiled. "Then let's use the bonus well." Not long after, Robert invited Jimmy to speak at a youth retreat. Dozens of high school students gathered in the church auditorium, slouched in their chairs, half listening to praise music. But when Jimmy took the stage, everything changed. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He just talked. "I lost everything," he said. "Not just money or a home. I lost me. But someone believed in me when I couldn't. And now I'm here to tell you, your mistakes don't define you. But your choices? They can redeem you." When he finished, the room was still. Then, one by one, students stood up. Some cried, others clapped. A girl walked up to him after and whispered, "My dad's on the street. Maybe there's hope." Jimmy hugged her and said, "There always is." That night as they drove home, Robert looked over at Jimmy. "You've become more than a friend. You've become a witness." Jimmy chuckled. "Funny. I thought you were the one saving souls." "We all save each other in some way," Robert said. "Sometimes just by showing up." Weeks later, Robert received an invitation to speak at a national conference on poverty and faith in Washington, D.C. He accepted, but on one condition. Jimmy would come too, and they'd speak together. The conference hall was filled with clergy, theologians, activists. Jimmy stood beside Robert on the main stage, this time not as a case study, but as a co-speaker. Robert began. "We often quote scripture about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. But what does that look like? Sometimes it looks like sitting beside someone on a bench." Then Jimmy spoke. "I thought the church had no place for me. I was wrong. The church is where broken people belong. That's what makes it holy." The standing ovation lasted minutes. Afterward, journalists approached. "Mr. O'Malley, do you think Bishop Barron changed your life?" Jimmy smiled. "No. I think he reminded me of my life, and of who I was always meant to be." From that point on, the two of them became something of a team. Not officially, not formally, but spiritually. Robert continued to preach, to teach, to guide. Jimmy became a voice in his own right, visiting schools, prisons, shelters. Not just telling his story, but listening to others, drawing them out of the shadows. And every time he told someone that they were not alone, that their story wasn't over, he saw a flicker of something he knew well: hope, fragile and fierce. Back home in Chicago, the church started a new initiative inspired by their story. It was called the Bench Ministry. Volunteers were trained to walk the streets with intention, not to preach, not to rescue, but to sit, listen, and see. Benches were marked across the city with small brass plaques that read, "This seat is sacred. Sit, listen, love." Jimmy visited one of those benches often. Sometimes he sat alone watching people pass. Sometimes someone sat beside him, and when they did, he listened, just as Robert had done for him. And so, the man who once believed he had nothing left to give, now gave the one thing that had saved him: presence. It was a cloudy afternoon when Jimmy received a call that made his heart race. It was from the city council. They wanted to honor him and Bishop Barron for their impact on the homeless community in Chicago. A formal ceremony, a recognition for extraordinary service and restoration of dignity to the forgotten. Jimmy didn't know what to say. "I'm not a hero," he muttered after hanging up. Robert smiled when he heard. "You don't have to be. Sometimes being present is heroic enough." The ceremony was held at City Hall. The mayor gave a speech. Local media filmed. Dozens of people Jimmy had helped came to support him. Some brought homemade signs. Others brought hugs. Robert stood beside him on stage as they received their plaques. But he made sure Jimmy held his own alone when the moment came. When Jimmy stepped up to the microphone to say a few words, the room went quiet. "I never imagined this," he said. "A year ago, I was invisible. People passed me like I was part of the sidewalk. Now I'm standing here, not because I climbed some ladder, but because someone looked me in the eyes and said, 'You matter.' That's what we all want, really. To matter. To be seen. And I promise you, there are people outside this building right now, freezing, starving, praying that someone will see them." He paused. "I was one of them, and now I will spend the rest of my life seeing others, because dignity is not a luxury, it's a right, and compassion. Compassion is a choice." The room erupted in applause. Later, as he and Robert walked back to the car, Jimmy was quiet. The weight of the moment had humbled him, but also stirred something deeper. "I've been thinking," he said, "about going back to school." Robert raised an eyebrow. "School?" "Yeah," Jimmy replied. "Not a degree or anything crazy. Just some theology classes. I want to understand more. Not just about scripture, but about why people like me fall through the cracks. I want to help. Better." Robert nodded slowly. "Then let's find you a program." Within a few weeks, Jimmy was enrolled in a community seminary extension course. Twice a week, he sat in a classroom with others, some fresh out of college, others retired clergy. He soaked in every lecture, took notes obsessively, and asked questions that impressed even the most seasoned professors. He began to understand that his pain had been a classroom too, his lived experience, a kind of curriculum. Now he was merging that with knowledge. It made his testimony stronger, fuller, more rooted. One professor pulled Robert aside after class one day and said, "He's got something, not just experience, he has wisdom." Robert smiled. He always did. Life just had to break it open. Meanwhile, the bench ministry continued to grow. Other cities reached out asking how to replicate the model. Robert and Jimmy put together a toolkit, practical steps for churches and organizations to start their own presence-based outreach. They spoke at conferences, led workshops, even published a small booklet, From the Bench to Belief, a guide to seeing the unseen. But not everyone was on board. Some critics accused them of idealizing homelessness, of creating dependency, of playing savior. Articles surfaced questioning whether the church should be doing more systemic work instead of symbolic gestures. Robert addressed it head-on during a national radio interview. "This isn't about heroism, it's about humanity. Sitting on a bench with someone doesn't solve poverty, but it does begin to heal the soul. And healing the soul is often the first step to healing the life." Jimmy, when asked about the backlash, said simply, "They can say what they want. I'll keep showing up." And he did. He visited shelters, prisons, recovery centers. One day, he got a letter from a man on death row who had seen a video of his story. The letter read, "I don't have much time left, but after hearing what you said, I prayed for the first time in 30 years. I just wanted you to know. You reached someone, even here." Jimmy cried when he read it, not out of sorrow, but awe. He brought the letter to Robert. "I'm not qualified for this," he said. "No one is," Robert replied. That's why grace steps in. Months turned into a full year since the bench. Jimmy moved into a slightly bigger apartment. He still worked part-time at the bookstore but spent most of his energy now speaking and ministering. He even started his own outreach, small care packages for the homeless, each with snacks, socks, and a handwritten note. "You are seen. You are loved. Keep going." One evening, he invited Robert over for dinner. Jimmy cooked spaghetti, and they ate at a small table by the window. The sunset poured in like liquid gold. "I've been thinking," Jimmy said, twirling pasta on his fork, "about maybe becoming a deacon someday." Robert's eyebrows lifted. "Really? I don't know if I'm qualified. I don't know if I'm ready, but I feel this tug. Like everything in my life was leading to something bigger, something deeper." Robert leaned back in his chair. "I think you'd be a great deacon, and I think the world needs voices like yours in the church." Jimmy smiled. "Then maybe I'll try." They clinked glasses, water, not wine, and sat in comfortable silence as the light faded. Outside, the city moved on, fast, chaotic, loud. But in that small apartment, two old friends, once separated by a chasm of time and pain, sat together, whole, present, and completely aligned with the quiet, redemptive rhythm of grace. Jimmy's decision to pursue the diaconate stirred something within the community. Word spread quickly. "The man from the bench wants to be a deacon." Some were skeptical, but most were inspired. His story had already touched thousands, but now it was becoming something even more sacred. A calling, a mission. Robert walked with him through every step. He introduced Jimmy to the diocese's vocations director, helped him gather the necessary paperwork, and even wrote a personal letter of recommendation. "He doesn't come with a clean resume," Robert wrote. "He comes with scars, and it's those very scars that make him more fit for ministry than most." Jimmy began the formal discernment process, attending weekend classes and spiritual formation sessions. He studied Scripture more deeply than ever before, spending long hours with the Gospels, especially the story of the prodigal son. He wept each time he read the part where the father ran toward the son, not with judgment, but with arms wide open. "That's what Bishop Barron did for me," he once told his spiritual director. "He ran toward me when I didn't even have the strength to stand." Outside his studies, Jimmy kept up his street outreach. The care packages had evolved into a regular ministry, one he called Bags of Grace. Volunteers helped him prepare them each week. More than supplies, each bag included a personal note from Jimmy, often quoting scripture or a line from one of his talks. One particular evening, Jimmy handed a bag to a man near the train station. The man barely looked up, just mumbled a thank you, and tucked it under his coat. Jimmy thought nothing more of it. A month later, that same man walked into the St. Augustine Center, freshly shaved, seeking help. He held up the note from Jimmy's bag. "You wrote this?" he asked. Jimmy nodded. The man's eyes filled with tears. "That night, I was going to end my life. But this line, 'You are not forgotten, and your story still matters,' it stopped me. I read it over and over, and I thought, maybe someone does care." They embraced. No words needed. Moments like that became more common. People started calling Jimmy the street deacon, even though he hadn't yet been ordained. The name stuck, not as a title, but as a reflection of who he was becoming. Robert watched all of it unfold with quiet joy. At clergy gatherings, fellow bishops and priests asked him about Jimmy constantly. "Is it true?" they'd say. "He was homeless just a year ago?" Robert would smile. "Yes, and now he's reminding all of us what the gospel actually looks like." See, in one meeting, a bishop from another state approached Robert privately. "I have a man in my city," he said. "Similar story, but I didn't stop. I walked past him every day. I think about him now and wonder if I missed a chance." Robert placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "You might have missed a chance, but the next one is still ahead." Meanwhile, Jimmy's classes continued, and so did his speaking engagements. He was invited to a panel discussion at a university on faith in the margins. Students filled the auditorium, expecting a lecture. What they got was a testimony. He told them about addiction, about shame, about sleeping on frozen concrete. But then he told them about Robert, about the scarf, the gloves, the car ride home, about grace wrapped in human form. "The church didn't find me in a pew," he said. "It found me on a bench, cold, hungry, ready to give up. Don't ever underestimate where God might plant his feet." And after the panel, students surrounded him with questions. Some asked about theology, Others just wanted to shake his hand. One young man, eyes red, said, "I stopped believing in God when my dad died. But hearing you, I don't know." Something cracked open. Jimmy offered him his number. "Call me. We can talk any time." Back at home, Jimmy's walls slowly filled with notes, cards, and pictures, evidence of the lives he was touching. A letter from a boy who said Jimmy made him want to help the poor. A photo of a man reunited with his family after 5 years on the street. A hand-drawn picture from a girl who wrote, "You're like an angel with a backpack." But Jimmy never let it go to his head. He stayed grounded, washing dishes at the shelter, picking up trash after events, sitting with people who had no one else. And every Sunday, without fail, he sat in the same pew at Mass, quietly, humbly, the same way he had when he first returned. One Sunday, as Robert finished his homily, he looked out into the congregation and said, "You may have seen our friend Jimmy on television. You may have heard him speak, but what you need to know is this. Jimmy didn't find fame. He found faith. And through him, many of us have found it again too." The congregation stood and applauded. Jimmy lowered his head, overwhelmed, his heart thudding in his chest. That afternoon, over coffee, he turned to Robert and said, "Do you think I'm really worthy of this? All of it?" Robert looked at him, eyes gentle. "None of us are worthy. That's why it's called grace." Jimmy nodded slowly. "Then I'll keep walking. One step at a time." Robert raised his cup. "To the next step." And so, the man who once sat forgotten on a bench now walked boldly toward a future marked not by shame, but by service. His story wasn't just redemption. It was revival. A living testament that when one heart is restored, it has the power to awaken many more. The process of becoming a deacon wasn't easy. There were interviews, psychological evaluations, theological essays, and spiritual retreats. But Jimmy approached each step with the same humility that had carried him through recovery. He didn't try to impress. He simply told the truth. One of the most moving parts of the process was writing his spiritual autobiography. Jimmy spent days reflecting on his life, from his childhood with Robert, to the years of struggle, to the bench beneath the underpass, and beyond. When he handed the paper to the diaconate board, he included a quote at the top, "God found me not in a cathedral, but in the chaos." His story didn't sugarcoat anything. He wrote about his addictions, his failures, the nights he thought death would be a mercy. But he also wrote about resurrection, not the kind that happens in an instant, but the kind that comes slowly, in quiet acts of mercy, in people who refuse to look away. The board was deeply moved. One of the evaluators said afterward, "It's one of the most honest, Christ-centered testimonies I've ever read." Robert, who served as his spiritual sponsor, sat in on part of the review process. He watched with quiet joy as Jimmy answered questions with a calm, confident heart. There was still the same spark in him, the deep well of compassion. But now it was refined by discipline and prayer. Back in Chicago, the bench ministry continued to grow. A documentary filmmaker, inspired by their story, asked to follow Jimmy for several weeks to create a short film. After some hesitation, Jimmy agreed, on one condition. "It can't be about me," he said. "It has to be about them, the ones still on the bench." The filmmaker honored that request. The final product, titled "The Bench is Still Warm," debuted at a local theater. It captured Jimmy walking the streets, praying with people, handing out bags of grace, and sharing coffee with those the world had overlooked. It also included candid interviews with Robert, the St. Augustine staff, and even a few of the people Jimmy had once served beside in the shelter. The premiere was packed. People from every walk of life attended: clergy, city officials, former addicts, high school students, nuns, and businessmen. Robert introduced the film with a simple line: "If grace had a face in this city, it would look like Jimmy O'Malley." When the lights came back on, the audience was in tears. People lined up to speak to Jimmy afterward. Some just shook his hand. Others told him how the film had changed their view of homelessness forever. Later that night, as they walked home, Jimmy turned to Robert. "I still can't believe this is my life." Robert looked up at the stars and said, "Maybe it's not your life anymore. Maybe it belongs to the ones you're saving now." That spring, Jimmy was invited to preach a reflection during Holy Week at the cathedral. The bishop had asked him personally. It was the first time in his life Jimmy would stand at the ambo during a sacred liturgy. He spent weeks preparing. When the day came, the cathedral was full. He stepped up, took a deep breath, and began. "When I was on the street," he said, "I used to walk past this cathedral. I looked up at the stained glass and wondered if the people inside knew there was a man sleeping outside. I didn't think they cared. I didn't think God cared. But I was wrong." He paused. God was there, watching, waiting. And when I was finally ready, he didn't yell at me. He didn't demand perfection. He just sat beside me, through a friend, through a gesture, through a scarf in the cold, and said, "I'm still here." That's who Jesus is. He doesn't wait for you to be clean. He meets you in the mud and lifts you out. There was silence, then sniffles, then applause that rose and swelled like a wave. After the service, an elderly woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "My son was homeless for years," she said. "He died before I got to say I loved him. But hearing you tonight, I felt like he was here." Jimmy hugged her tightly, saying nothing, just being present. Meanwhile, Robert continued his work as bishop, but with a renewed sense of purpose. His homilies were sharper, more grounded. He pushed his diocese to take bold steps, opening more warming shelters, expanding addiction recovery ministries, investing in mental health support. He often credited Jimmy publicly. "I'm the one with the title," he'd say, "but he's the one who taught me how to see again." In private, their friendship remained simple. They still had coffee every week. They still teased each other about their childhood quirks. Robert had begun writing a book, part memoir, part theology, and dedicated an entire chapter to Jimmy. He titled it, "The Gospel According to the Bench." One afternoon, as they sat in Robert's backyard under the budding trees, Jimmy turned to him. "You know," he said, "there's a man I've seen sleeping outside the church lately, always in the same spot." Robert nodded. "Have you talked to him?" "Not yet," Jimmy replied. "But tomorrow I'm bringing him coffee, maybe a scarf too." Robert smiled. "Good. Keep the bench warm." And so Jimmy did. Every day, every step, every act of compassion. He kept the bench warm for the next soul who needed to be seen. The next morning, Jimmy rose early. He brewed 2 cups of strong coffee and packed a sandwich in foil, slipping in a granola bar and an orange. He wrapped a clean scarf around his neck, tucked the second one under his arm, and headed toward the cathedral. The sky was overcast, and the city buzzed with the usual rhythm. Commuters rushing past, horns echoing in the distance, and the faint sound of a saxophone playing down the block. He spotted the man just outside the cathedral gate, slumped against the wall, wrapped in a torn blanket. His beard was thick and gray, and his eyes were closed, his face resting against the cold stone. Jimmy approached slowly. "Morning," he said gently. The man stirred, startled, blinking up at him. "I brought you something." Jimmy continued, crouching down. He offered the coffee, then the sandwich. The man accepted both with a quiet nod, his fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the warmth of the cup. "What's your name?" Jimmy asked. "Ray," the man said hoarsely. "Raymond." "I'm Jimmy," he replied. "I used to sit right where you are." Ray looked at him, confused. "You?" Jimmy nodded. "A year and a half ago. Right over there. Same spot. I thought I was done." Ray took a sip of the coffee, watching Jimmy carefully. "What changed?" Jimmy didn't hesitate. "Someone sat beside me." They talked for over an hour. Ray's story was a familiar one. Laid off from his job, evicted, estranged from his children, forgotten by most. Jimmy listened, truly listened, just as Robert had done for him. When Ray finished, Jimmy stood and unwrapped the second scarf. "Take this," he said. "It helped me once." Ray took it, eyes glistening. "Why are you doing this?" Jimmy smiled. "Because you're worth it." That moment sparked something. Ray began visiting the St. Augustine Center. Jimmy introduced him to Curtis, his old counselor, and helped him sign up for the same transitional housing program. Within weeks, Ray had a place to sleep, clean clothes, and an ID card. He also had a friend. Robert watched from a distance as Jimmy repeated the same cycle of presence, patience, and love again and again. With Ray, with others, always quietly, never seeking praise. One day, during a lunch with diocesan staff, Robert stood up with a surprising announcement. "Next spring," he said, "Jimmy O'Malley will be ordained a permanent deacon in the Catholic Church." The room erupted in applause. A few months later, the preparations began. Jimmy chose a simple white stole for his vestments and requested that his first official act as a deacon be performed not in the cathedral, but in the chapel at the St. Augustine Center. He wanted to preach to the men who still lived where he once did. The night before the ordination, Robert invited Jimmy to the cathedral. The two of them sat in silence for a long time before Robert finally spoke. "You nervous?" Jimmy chuckled. "Terrified?" Robert smiled. "Good. That means your heart's in the right place." Jimmy looked up at the towering crucifix above the altar. "You think I'll be good at this?" "I think you already are," Robert said. "Ordination just makes it official." Jimmy swallowed hard. "You changed my life." Robert turned to him. "No, I sat down. You changed your life, and now you're changing others." The day of the ordination was bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the cathedral windows like rivers of grace. The pews were packed. Parishioners, shelter residents, volunteers, city officials, seminary professors, students, and strangers who had followed his journey online. Robert laid hands on Jimmy's head as the ancient rite was spoken. The ceremony was solemn, sacred, full of meaning. When Jimmy stood, now vested as Deacon James O'Malley, the congregation rose in thunderous applause. Tears streamed down his face. His first homily, given in the same chapel where he once stood as a guest speaker, was simple. "God found me on a bench," he said, "and now I want to spend the rest of my life making sure no one else is left sitting there alone." That night, Jimmy returned to his apartment and placed his new stole beside his Bible. He sat by the window and watched the stars. A knock came at the door. It was Robert. "I figured you wouldn't sleep much," he said, holding a bottle of sparkling apple cider. Jimmy laughed and let him in. They toasted at the tiny kitchen table. "To grace," Robert said. "To presence," Jimmy replied. Then they both said together, "To the bench." They sat late into the night, reminiscing, dreaming, and planning. Jimmy wanted to start a training program to teach others how to do what he did, how to see, how to listen, how to love without fixing. And Robert, never one to rest for long, began imagining ways the diocese could integrate Jimmy's methods into seminary formation, teaching future priests to spend time on benches before pulpits. As they spoke, they didn't notice the time, but somewhere in the city, another soul sat alone on another cold bench, waiting for the same mercy. And they both knew, with certainty, that it was only a matter of time before someone else showed up. Because once a bench has been warmed by love, it can never truly grow cold again. The summer following Jimmy's ordination bloomed with opportunity. His calendar quickly filled with invitations, parishes asking him to preach, schools requesting talks, shelters hoping he could offer a blessing or just a listening ear. But Jimmy remained grounded, careful never to lose touch with the streets, the shelters, and the broken places where he had been born again. He created a small routine. Mornings were for prayer and study. Afternoons he visited the St. Augustine Center or helped with the growing bench ministry, now a fully recognized outreach within the diocese. Evenings were often spent in quiet conversations with the forgotten, sometimes on actual benches, sometimes on steps, sidewalks, or curbs. The location never mattered, only the presence did. Raymond, the man Jimmy had met outside the cathedral, was now in his own apartment. He had a part-time job cleaning a local parish and had begun sponsoring others in recovery. He and Jimmy remained close. Once, over dinner, Ray said, "I didn't think I had a future, but now, I'm part of someone else's hope. That's wild, man." Jimmy laughed. "That's grace, my friend." As the months passed, Jimmy found himself drawn more deeply into spiritual direction. People didn't just want his story, they wanted his counsel. He began training in pastoral care, learning how to walk with people through grief, trauma, addiction, and loss. His lived experience gave him insight, and his kindness gave him access to hearts that had been long closed. One day, Robert invited Jimmy to a retreat center outside the city. The diocese had planned a weekend for young men discerning the priesthood, and Robert wanted Jimmy to speak at the opening session. "I'm not a priest," Jimmy said. "You don't need to be," Robert replied. "Just tell them the truth." So Jimmy stood before a room full of college students, seminarians, and young professionals. He didn't talk about theology first. He talked about despair, about shame, about the terrifying silence of being forgotten. And then he talked about light. Not the blinding kind, but the kind that slips under a door when you thought all hope was locked out. "God didn't rescue me because I was strong," he told them. "He rescued me because someone showed up, and because I said yes, not all at once, but a little more each day." After the talk, one of the seminarians approached him. "My brother's homeless," he said. "I haven't seen him in years. But hearing you, I think I need to try." Again, Jimmy nodded. "Find him. Sit with him. Let the rest come later." Back in Chicago, Jimmy began leading a weekly outdoor prayer circle. Every Thursday at 7 p.m., on a grassy patch near the Riverwalk, people would gather. Homeless and housed, young and old, addicts and ministers. They prayed, sang, shared testimonies. Sometimes they just sat in silence together. The city took notice. One reporter asked him during an interview, "What's your secret?" Jimmy smiled. "There's no secret. Just show up, love people, don't leave." Meanwhile, Robert continued his episcopal duties, quietly weaving Jimmy's influence through every layer of diocesan planning. He pushed for affordable housing initiatives, mental health chaplaincy in hospitals, and expanded street-level ministry training for seminarians. He often quoted Jimmy in his speeches. "The church is not a building," he'd say. "It's a bench where someone is waiting to be seen." One day, as they walked together after evening mass, Jimmy turned to Robert with a strange look in his eyes. "You ever wonder why it was you that day?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The day on the bench. You could have gone home. You could have driven past me like everyone else. But you didn't. Why?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. I think I needed saving too. I was preaching mercy, but I hadn't touched it in a long time. That day, I saw you, and something in me woke up." Jimmy nodded. "So we saved each other." "I guess we did." A week later, Jimmy received a letter from a woman in Michigan. She was a teacher, and her class had watched the Benches Still Warm documentary as part of a social justice curriculum. Each student had written a letter to Jimmy. They filled the envelope with words like, "You made me believe people can change. I want to be someone who sees others like you do. Yeah, you gave me hope for my dad." Jimmy read every letter, then he cried, deeply, not from sadness but from awe. Later, he brought the stack to Robert. "I think I want to visit that school," he said, "not to speak, just to listen." Robert nodded. "That's how you change the world, one presence at a time." That weekend, Jimmy traveled to Michigan. He walked into the classroom quietly, carrying nothing but his Bible and a heart ready to receive. The kids asked questions. Some cried. One boy stayed behind afterward and whispered, "My mom's in jail. I've never told anyone. But now I think I want to write to her." Jimmy knelt beside him, looked him in the eyes and said, "Tell her you still love her. That alone can bring light." Back in Chicago, the prayer circles grew. More people came. A local priest began bringing communion. A musician showed up each week with a guitar. What had started as a handful of voices in the dark had become a movement of love. And through it all, Jimmy kept returning to the bench. Sometimes he sat alone, just praying. Sometimes someone joined him. And sometimes, miraculously, it was someone ready to begin again. Autumn arrived with crisp winds and amber leaves tumbling through the streets of Chicago. The season of change felt symbolic for Jimmy. Another cycle turning, another chapter opening. It had been 2 years since that cold day on the bench, but it felt like a lifetime. The man he had been then still lived within him. But now he stood rooted in something deeper: calling, conviction, and community. He had just finished a pastoral visit at a hospital, his first as a deacon. A young man recovering from an overdose had requested prayer. Jimmy sat beside him for nearly an hour, simply holding his hand, letting the silence speak more than his words ever could. Before leaving, the young man whispered, "I didn't think God would still want me." Jimmy replied softly, "Neither did I once," but he never left either of us. That night, back at his apartment, Jimmy lit a candle by the window and pulled out the old Bible Robert had returned to him. Its pages were worn now from use. Inside, he had added his own notes, layers of wisdom drawn from street ministry, study, and tears. He flipped to Luke 15, the parable of the lost sheep, and underlined a new sentence. And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. A knock interrupted his meditation. He opened the door to find Robert holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I figured it was time," the bishop said. Jimmy opened it carefully, revealing a beautifully carved wooden cross, rough around the edges, handmade, imperfect. "It's from a man in the diocese prison ministry," Robert explained. "He saw your story, said it helped him forgive his brother after 15 years of silence. He made this for you." Jimmy ran his fingers over the texture of the wood. "This feels holy." "It is," Robert said. "So are you." The next day, Jimmy brought the cross to the St. Augustine Center. He hung it on the wall above the chapel altar, just before leading morning prayer for the residents. He told them where it came from, who had made it, and why it mattered. "Redemption isn't just something we receive," he said. "It's something we pass on. Every scar can become a bridge if we let it." Curtis, his old counselor, stood in the back, beaming with pride. Later that week, Jimmy returned to the bench near Michigan Avenue. His bench. He noticed someone sitting there. A young woman, early 20s maybe, with matted hair and haunted eyes. She was hugging her knees, lost in her own storm. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat beside her. Minutes passed. Finally, she turned. "You don't have to sit here." "I know," Jimmy said, "but I want to." She looked at him suspiciously. "Why?" "Because someone once did it for me." Her lip trembled. "People usually just stare or walk faster." "I used to think I didn't matter," Jimmy replied. "Then someone reminded me I did. You matter too." She started to cry. Quietly at first, then with deep, aching sobs that made her shoulders shake. Jimmy offered her his scarf. When she calmed down, she told him her name, Sierra. She'd aged out of the foster system, had been couch surfing until the couches ran out, hadn't eaten in 2 days. Jimmy bought her dinner, sat with her, listened, and later he brought her to the St. Augustine Center. She stayed. Weeks passed and she began to heal. Another story. Another ripple. Meanwhile, Jimmy began writing a book, at Robert's encouragement. Not a memoir, but a guide for ministers, volunteers, and ordinary people who wanted to walk with the broken. He called it Sacred Spaces, Ministry from the Margins. Each chapter told a story, a life touched, a lesson learned, a moment where presence broke through pain. Robert wrote the foreword. "If you read this book," he wrote, "expect to be changed. Because Jimmy doesn't write from theory. He writes from the dirt, the tears, and the grace of lived compassion." The publisher asked for a photo for the back cover. Jimmy chose one of him on the bench, sitting beside Raymond, both laughing with coffee cups in hand. Not staged, not polished, just real. The book was released quietly, but its impact spread quickly. Parishes across the country began using it for training. Seminaries added it to their reading lists. One cardinal sent a letter saying, "This is the kind of theology the church needs," one written in footsteps and scars. One night, after a long day of ministry, Jimmy and Robert sat once more in the bishop's backyard. The trees were bare now. The fire pit glowed softly between them. "You ever wonder," Jimmy said, "what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Robert poked the fire with a stick. "All the time." "And?" Jimmy pressed. "I think God would have found another way. But I'm glad he chose that way. That bench, that moment, you." Jimmy stared into the flames. "I want to build more benches, not just in Chicago, everywhere. Places where people know they're safe, seen, sacred." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Then let's do it. We'll call it the Bench Network. And just like that, another chapter began. Plans were drafted, grants written, parishes contacted. Within months, the first official Bench Network pilot launched in 3 cities. Jimmy traveled to each, training local leaders, sharing his story, blessing the benches. In each city, he left the same message engraved on a small plaque. You are not alone. This seat is sacred. And everywhere he went, people came, not to be fixed, but to be found. Because when someone finally sees you, it doesn't just change your day, it changes your life. The Bench Network quickly blossomed into something far beyond what Jimmy or Robert had imagined. What started as a humble idea, a place to sit with the hurting, became a movement. Cities began requesting benches, not just physical ones, but training programs, workshops, and spiritual formation rooted in Jimmy's approach to presence-based ministry. Volunteers across the country wore simple pins that read, "I sit." Those 2 words became a quiet rallying cry. Not "I fix," not "I save," just "I sit." And that was enough. Jimmy traveled constantly now, quiet flights to small towns, late-night bus rides to shelters, early morning talks in classrooms. But no matter where he went, he kept a piece of home with him. The old scarf from that day, his Bible, and a photo of him and Robert at the original bench. One weekend, while in Albuquerque launching a new Bench Network site, Jimmy received a phone call from Curtis at the St. Augustine Center. "Raymond's in the hospital," Curtis said. "Collapsed yesterday, heart complications. They're not sure how long he has." Jimmy was on the next flight. He arrived at the hospital late in the evening. The halls were dimly lit, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. When he entered the room, Raymond lay still, hooked up to tubes and monitors. His breathing was labored, but his eyes lit up when he saw Jimmy. "You came," Raymond whispered. "Of course I came." Jimmy sat beside him, gripping his hand. "I didn't want to leave without saying thank you," Raymond murmured. "You sat with me, when no one else would." Jimmy wiped tears from his eyes. "And you did the same for others, Ray. Don't forget that." They talked for hours. About grace, about pain, about the mystery of it all. Before dawn, Raymond asked for a blessing. Jimmy placed his hand gently on Ray's forehead, prayed, and whispered, "You are seen. You are loved. Go in peace." Raymond passed away the next evening, surrounded by shelter staff, friends, and a priest Jimmy had called in. The funeral was small but beautiful. Robert presided. Jimmy gave the eulogy. "Raymond didn't die forgotten," he said. "He died known. He died loved. And he leaves behind a legacy, not of power or wealth, but of presence. That's what we're all called to leave." Jimmy carried Raymond's ashes to a quiet hill near the cathedral, where they planted a tree in his memory. At the base, they placed a bench. The plaque read, "In loving memory of Raymond, he sat, he listened, he loved." That night, Jimmy and Robert walked silently along the river. The stars shimmered above them. "Sometimes," Jimmy said softly, "this all feels too big for me, like I'm not equipped." Robert stopped walking. "You know what makes a good deacon?" Jimmy shook his head. "The willingness to weep, to stay, to be there. That's what you do." They continued walking. The city buzzed in the distance, but all Jimmy heard was peace. In the following months, Jimmy continued his writing. His second book, The Ministry of Sitting, dove deeper into the theology of presence. It challenged traditional ministry models and called for a radical return to the incarnational heart of the gospel, God with us. The book became a quiet bestseller among clergy, lay ministers, and even secular counselors. Jimmy received invitations to speak at places he never imagined: universities, TEDx events, even a panel at the Vatican focused on urban ministry. At every event, he said the same thing: don't underestimate what happens when you just sit with someone. During a national conference in Los Angeles, Jimmy sat on stage before a crowd of thousands. The moderator asked, "What would you say to someone who feels like they've failed too many times to come back?" Jimmy thought for a moment. "I'd say, you're not too far gone, you're just not home yet, and there's a bench waiting for you. We'll keep it warm until you arrive." That line went viral. The image of the bench became a symbol across social media. People started painting park benches with phrases like "sacred space" and "this is love in wood and metal." A street artist in Detroit painted a mural of Jimmy sitting beside Jesus on a bench, both laughing. Through it all, Jimmy stayed humble. He kept working at the bookstore once a week. He kept praying every morning at sunrise. And he never missed his Thursday night prayer circles, now sometimes numbering over 100 people, gathered in quiet reverence by the river. One particular Thursday, a man approached him after the circle. Mid-40s, scruffy beard, nervous energy. "You probably don't remember me," the man said. Jimmy looked at him, then blinked. "Tommy?" The man nodded. "Tommy Johnson. We were in high school together." Jimmy laughed, stunned. "What? How? I saw a video of you online. I couldn't believe it. You were always the quiet one. Now look at you." Tommy hesitated. "I've been struggling. Divorced. Drinking too much. Lost my job. Saw your video one night when I was at my lowest. It pulled me back. I'm in a program now. Been sober 6 months." Jimmy felt a lump in his throat. "That's incredible, man. I'm proud of you. I came tonight to thank you, and maybe to ask if we could sit sometime. Just talk." Jimmy smiled. Of course, there's always a bench. So they sat. 2 old classmates, 2 broken and rebuilt men, and the bench once again became holy ground. Winter crept back into the city with soft snowfalls and long nights. But even in the coldest months, the bench network never stopped. If anything, it grew stronger. Volunteers bundled in layers to serve hot meals at the benches, prayer circles moved indoors but stayed alive with testimonies and warmth, and Jimmy, now known across the country as the Deacon of the Streets, continued to sit faithfully wherever he was needed. He and Robert met every Sunday afternoon for tea and reflection. They often sat in Robert's study, surrounded by books and quiet light, processing the whirlwind of the past few years. One afternoon, as snow dusted the windowsill, Robert turned to Jimmy with a contemplative look. "Do you ever think about priesthood?" Jimmy chuckled, caught off guard. "Me? Come on, I was homeless. I'm barely a deacon." Robert raised an eyebrow. "That's exactly why. You carry something many of us don't, a heart broken open by the gospel. The church needs that now more than ever." Jimmy leaned back in his chair. "I've thought about it, quietly. I've prayed, but I never thought it was possible." "Nothing about your life has followed the usual path," Robert said with a grin. "Why should this?" Jimmy didn't answer, but that night he knelt by his bed, staring at the crucifix above his desk. "Lord," he whispered, "if you're calling me deeper, I'm listening." Meanwhile, the Bench Network expanded internationally. Parishes in Ireland, Brazil, and the Philippines reached out asking to join. Jimmy created a simple guide in multiple languages, sharing not doctrine but invitation. Sit, stay, see. No programs, no complex systems, just love, incarnate and constant. He was invited to speak at a global summit on social justice in Rome. It was his first time overseas. Robert traveled with him, partly as a fellow speaker but mostly as support. Rome overwhelmed Jimmy. The grandeur, the history, the layers of church and tradition. But even amid the splendor, he found something familiar, a group of men sleeping beneath an overpass near the Vatican. Jimmy brought them sandwiches and sat with them, right there in the cold Italian night. One man shared in broken English that he used to be a theology professor. Another had once been a seminarian. "Now," the man said with a bitter smile, "we are invisible." Jimmy shook his head. "Not to me, not to God." The next day, in his keynote address, Jimmy spoke of them. "We gather here to talk about justice, but it begins on the sidewalk. It begins in seeing the professor beneath the bridge, the addict in the pew, the prodigal in the mirror. Justice begins with presence." After his speech, he was approached by a cardinal who had been visibly moved. "You're doing what the church has spoken of for centuries," the cardinal said. "You're living it." Jimmy bowed his head, humbled. "I'm just trying to be who someone was for me." And back home, Jimmy resumed his rhythms. Thursday night prayer, hospital visits, late-night bench conversations. But something in him was shifting. a quiet stirring that wouldn't go away. One day, while praying alone in the cathedral, he looked up at the stained glass window of St. Francis. The sun hit it just right, illuminating the saint's face with a gentle glow. And Jimmy heard it. Not a voice, not a sound, but something deeper. "Come further." He exhaled. "Okay." The next time he saw Robert, he didn't hesitate. "I want to begin discernment for the priesthood." Robert smiled like he'd been waiting for this moment. Then we walked together. Again. The process would be long, complex, unconventional. But there was precedent. Other former addicts, former convicts, even former atheists had become priests. The church didn't call the qualified, it qualified the called. As Jimmy began this new journey, the bench network kept growing. Curtis, now director of the Chicago branch, oversaw most of the day-to-day operations. Sierra, the young woman Jimmy had met a year ago, was now studying social work and interning with the shelter. Her smile had returned. Her voice had strength. "I want to be for someone what you were for me," she told Jimmy one day. "You already are," he replied. Jimmy's formation for the priesthood included studies, spiritual direction, psychological screening, and more public scrutiny than ever. Some questioned his past. Others doubted his stability. But the testimony of those he had walked with silenced most critics. Robert defended him fiercely. "If scandal is our concern," he said to a group of skeptics, "then we should remember Christ dined with scandal. He chose fishermen, tax collectors, and broken men. Why wouldn't he choose Jimmy?" One morning during his third year of formation, Jimmy received a letter from a man in prison. The handwriting was shaky, the paper stained. "You sat with my brother before he died. I didn't believe in God then, but I do now. Because someone like you saw someone like him. Thank you." Jimmy kept the letter folded in his Bible. He was different now. Still the same soul, still soft-spoken, still humble, but tempered by fire, shaped by mercy. When people looked at him, they didn't see a former addict or a homeless man. They saw a priest in the making. And yet, Jimmy never stopped sitting. Even as his ordination date approached, he made time to visit the original bench. One cold afternoon, he sat quietly, sipping coffee. A teenager walked by, stopped, and asked, "Are you the guy from the internet?" Jimmy laughed. "I guess so." The kid sat beside him, said nothing for a while. Then, "I don't believe in God." Jimmy smiled. "That's okay. He still believes in you." They sat like that for an hour, just two strangers, on a bench. Spring returned to Chicago in a burst of light and renewal. Trees bloomed across the parks. The river shimmered with a new brightness. And in the cathedral bulletin one Sunday morning, a quiet announcement appeared. With great joy, the Archdiocese of Chicago announces that Deacon James O'Malley will be ordained to the priesthood this coming Pentecost. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across the country, some from bishops, others from people Jimmy had never met. Former shelter residents, high school students, even atheists who had followed his journey online sent messages of support. Robert, too, received letters, many asking if the story was true. "Is this the same Jimmy O'Malley, the one who lived on the streets?" Robert responded to each with the same simple line, "Yes, and he is exactly who the church needs now." The weeks leading up to the ordination were a whirlwind. Jimmy continued his studies and pastoral assignments while preparing his heart for what was to come. He fasted more, prayed longer, sat even more intentionally on the bench, knowing that soon he would rise from it wearing a collar, not just in spirit, but in sacrament. He chose to keep the ceremony simple. No fanfare, no press, just a quiet mass at the cathedral, open to the public, with one condition: everyone is welcome. The night before Pentecost, Jimmy and Robert shared dinner at Robert's home. The table was set like it always was. Nothing fancy, just two friends and a meal. "You ready?" Robert asked. Jimmy took a long breath. "Yes and no. It still feels like I'm dreaming." Robert smiled gently. "It's not a dream. It's the fulfillment of a story that started on a bench." Jimmy looked down, thoughtful. I keep thinking about all the people who didn't make it. Raymond, that boy I met in Detroit. Others who didn't get a second chance. They live in your story, Robert said. In your vocation, you carry them with you every time you sit down, every time you preach, every time you hold the host. That night, Jimmy didn't sleep much. He lay in bed with his hands folded, whispering prayers, thanking God for not giving up on him, especially in the moments he had given up on himself. Pentecost morning dawned bright and warm. The cathedral was full before the bells even rang. People from all walks of life arrived. Former shelter residents dressed in their best clothes, businessmen who'd read his books, priests and deacons, families, students. Even Sierra, now a college graduate, sat in the second row with tears already in her eyes. The choir began to sing as the procession entered. Robert led the line, followed by seminarians, clergy, and finally Jimmy, dressed in white, hands folded, eyes brimming with awe. As he knelt before the altar, Robert approached. The laying on of hands was quiet, powerful. The silence in the cathedral was thick with reverence. One by one, each priest present followed Robert's gesture, invoking the spirit in tradition passed down through generations. When Jimmy stood again, now Dr. James O'Malley, he turned slowly to face the people, and the entire congregation rose to their feet, erupting in applause, cheers, and tears. Some stood on pews, others clapped wildly, some just knelt and wept. Jimmy smiled through tears. His first act as a priest was the Eucharist. When he lifted the host, his hands didn't shake. They were steady, sure, and marked by years of suffering transformed into love. After the Mass, the line to greet him wrapped around the block. But Jimmy didn't rush. He hugged every person, listened to every story, and looked each person in the eye. "You made me believe again," one woman whispered. "You gave my son hope when no one else did," said another. And from an older man in a wheelchair, eyes bright with memory, "You sat with me 10 years ago on a park bench. I never forgot." That night, after the crowd had gone, Jimmy returned to the original bench. Robert was already there, waiting with 2 cups of coffee. They sat in silence for a while. "Feels like a full circle," Jimmy said softly. Robert looked at him. "It's a new circle now." Jimmy nodded. "You know, when I first sat here, I thought my story was ending. And now? Now I know. It was just beginning." They toasted quietly with their coffee cups. "To grace," Robert said. "To presence," Jimmy answered. "To the God who never passes us by." They sat long into the evening, watching as the streetlights flickered on and the city hummed in the distance. And in the stillness, on that sacred bench, one priest and one bishop, 2 men whose paths had diverged and converged in divine timing, rested in the quiet joy of a life redeemed and a mission just beginning. Summer brought a warmth to Chicago that matched the quiet fire in Father Jimmy's heart. Now ordained, he stepped fully into his priesthood with the same humility and presence that had defined his journey from the very beginning. He declined a parish assignment at first, requesting instead to serve as a chaplain for the St. Augustine Center and the Bench Network full-time. "I want to stay close to the ones still on the edge," he told the bishop during his meeting. "That's where I found Christ. That's where I want to remain." Permission was granted without hesitation. Jimmy's days were full, celebrating daily Mass in the shelter chapel, hearing confessions under the elm tree in the courtyard, blessing food before it was served in the cafeteria, and always, always sitting on benches. He carried his priesthood lightly, never letting the collar create distance. He was still the same Jimmy, warm, direct, kind. But now his presence carried sacramental weight. One Friday afternoon, Jimmy received a call from Sierra. She had begun working as a social worker at a downtown women's center and had encountered a young woman named Maribel, 17, pregnant, and recently kicked out of her home. She was terrified and alone. "Can you come?" Sierra asked. "I'm on my way," Jimmy said. He arrived 30 minutes later with a small backpack. Inside was a blanket, snacks, and a rosary. Maribel was sitting in the waiting room, arms crossed, tears drying on her cheeks. Jimmy sat beside her. "Hi, I'm Jimmy." "You're the priest?" she asked. "Yeah," he said with a gentle smile, "but I'm also a guy who slept on benches and cried in alleyways, so don't worry, I don't bite." She smirked slightly. "I don't trust priests." "Totally fair," Jimmy nodded. "Want to tell me why?" She paused, then spoke, slowly, then all at once. Her story was messy, painful, beautiful. A mother gone, a father who didn't know how to love, a baby coming at the worst and best time. Jimmy listened, never interrupted. When she finished, she looked at him, exhausted. "I don't know if I believe in anything anymore." He handed her the rosary. "Then let me believe for you until you can again." She clutched the beads tightly. Over the next few weeks, Jimmy visited her often. He brought meals, helped her find temporary housing, sat through long appointments. And when her baby boy was born, he was in the waiting room, holding a tiny blue blanket he'd asked the shelter ladies to knit. She named the baby Luca James. "I thought of you," she said, voice trembling. Jimmy baptized Luca in the courtyard of the Women's Center, surrounded by volunteers, nurses, and a few other mothers. The sun was bright, and the air smelled of hope. "This child," Jimmy said as he poured the water, "was born into a hard world, but today we claim him for a kingdom where love always gets the final word." News of Father Jimmy's ministry spread again, this time through word of mouth. Not through headlines, but through stories. Shared in kitchens, whispered in shelters, spoken softly in prayer groups. He was becoming something rare, not just a symbol, but a shepherd. And yet, he never lost his rhythm. Thursday night prayer by the river, early mornings with scripture, long walks through the neighborhoods he once called home. One evening, as he passed a familiar underpass, he spotted someone new, an older man with a cane sitting against the wall, eyes downcast. Jimmy approached slowly, just as he always had. "Mind if I sit?" The man shrugged. Jimmy lowered himself onto the concrete beside him, the collar of his black shirt catching the late light. "Rough day?" Jimmy asked. The man snorted. "Rough life." Jimmy nodded. "Same here." The man turned and studied him. "You're a priest?" "Yeah. But you've been here before, on this ground." Jimmy smiled. "More than once." The man said nothing, but his shoulders softened. They sat together for an hour. When Jimmy left, he promised to return the next day with coffee. He did. And the next day, and the next. The man's name was Glenn. Another soul. Another story. Another bench. Meanwhile, Robert continued his Episcopal leadership, often speaking about the ministry of proximity. He credited Jimmy frequently in homilies and writings. The two remained close, spiritually, emotionally, and in mission. One afternoon, Robert invited Jimmy to a special mass at the seminary. The theme, "From the Margins to the Mission." Jimmy preached. He stood before future priests, some of whom had followed his story from afar, others meeting him for the first time. "I didn't come here from the top of the ladder," he said. "I came from the gutter, from frostbitten nights and cardboard beds. But I'm telling you, Christ meets us there, not in the success, but in the surrender." He paused. "You can learn theology in books, but you learn the gospel on benches. Don't forget that." Afterward, a seminarian approached him with tears in his eyes. "I was ready to leave. I didn't think I belonged. But your story, it brought me back." Jimmy hugged him. "Then keep going. The church needs your scars." And so he continued, walking, listening, sitting. His priesthood wasn't built on ceremony. It was built on presence. One person at a time. One bench at a time. One sacred conversation at a time. Because grace, as he always said, doesn't come crashing in with thunder. It shows up with coffee, silence, and the willingness to stay. Autumn rolled around again, and with it came the second anniversary of Jimmy's first night off the streets. He didn't mark the date with fanfare, no speeches, no celebration. Instead, he spent it the only way that felt right, sitting on the same bench where Robert had found him. He arrived early in the morning, before the city was fully awake. He brought 2 coffees, as always, one for him and one for whoever might need it. And as the sun rose behind the skyline, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Jimmy prayed silently. Thank you for not letting me disappear, for sending him, for not giving up." After a while, a young man with a hoodie and a skateboard passed by, hesitated, then doubled back. "You're the priest, right?" the kid asked. Jimmy smiled. "I am. Want to sit?" The kid nodded and dropped his board beside the bench. His name was Andre, 17, no father. Mother worked 2 jobs. Struggling with depression, skipping school, teetering on the edge. They talked for 2 hours. When Andre left, he took the extra coffee with him and Jimmy's phone number. "Call me anytime," Jimmy said. "I probably won't," Andre replied. "I know," Jimmy smiled. "But you might." Later that day, Jimmy walked to the shelter, where Sierra greeted him at the door with her usual warm grin. "You're glowing," she said. "It's the bench," he replied. "Always charges me back up." Inside, he led a small Bible study for the new residents. They were quiet at first, guarded, but by the end, 3 had stayed behind to talk. "I used to hate God," one of them confessed. "Then someone gave me one of your care bags. The note inside said, 'God's not done with you.' I still have it." Jimmy placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Neither am I. You're not alone." The rest of the week followed its rhythm. Hospital visits, confessions, prayer circles, meals served, benches warmed. But one morning, as Jimmy was preparing for Mass, he got a call from Robert's assistant. "Father, the bishop's not feeling well. He collapsed at home. He's in the hospital." Jimmy froze. His heart dropped. He rushed to the hospital, collar still crooked, jacket half-zipped. When he arrived, Robert was awake, but pale and hooked up to monitors. A minor stroke, the doctors said. He was stable but needed rest and a long period of recovery. Jimmy sat beside the bed, overwhelmed with emotion. "You scared me." Robert gave a weak smile. "Not the first time." They laughed softly, then fell into a quiet stillness. "You've got to take it easy," Jimmy said. "I know," Robert replied, "but I don't like easy." Jimmy nodded. "Me neither, but maybe now. You can sit on the bench for a while. Let me be the one who stays." Robert closed his eyes. "I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, Jimmy visited daily. He brought books, soup, notes from the shelter residents. Robert's room became a second chapel. Nurses began requesting blessings. Visitors brought flowers and stories of how Robert had changed their lives. One day, Robert looked at Jimmy and said, "You know, I've spent years preaching about Jesus, but watching you, it's like watching him walk around again, quiet, with coffee and compassion." Jimmy swallowed hard. "You're the reason I'm here. You sat with me." Robert shook his head. "Maybe, but you stood up. You walked. You became more than I ever imagined." Jimmy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross, the one Raymond had carved years ago. "I think this belongs to you," he said. Robert took it, his hand trembling slightly. He held it against his chest and whispered, "Thank you." Eventually, Robert was discharged and began recovery at a residence provided by the diocese. Jimmy visited every other day, bringing news from the street, updates on the bench network, and always laughter. Meanwhile, Andre, the kid from the bench, had started texting. Just short notes at first, then longer messages, then a phone call. "I think I want to talk to someone," he said. Jimmy connected him with a counselor, and stayed in touch, and listened, and never pushed. A month later, Andre showed up at the Thursday night prayer circle. He didn't say much, just sat in the back, but he stayed the whole time. Afterward, he told Jimmy, "I don't know if I believe yet, but I think I want to." Jimmy smiled. "That's more than enough." The bench network launched 5 more cities that fall. Jimmy traveled less now, focusing on local mentorship, letting others rise into leadership. He wasn't the only one sitting anymore, and that was the point. He trained volunteers personally, taught them not to fix, not to preach, but to be. Most of the time, he told them, the miracle is just staying when others leave. Back at the shelter, he baptized 3 adults that November. One of them was Glenn, the man he'd found under the underpass. "I still can't believe you saw something in me," Glenn said, drying his face after the baptism. Jimmy replied, "I didn't. I saw someone. That night, After a long day of ministry, Jimmy returned to his apartment. He sat by the window with a candle, opened his Bible, and read Psalm 34. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit." He closed his eyes and whispered, "I believe that. I've lived it." The city lights twinkled in the distance. The bench waited, as always, and somewhere someone was about to sit down for the first time, and Jimmy would be there. Winter settled in once again, casting a hush over the city. Snow blanketed the sidewalks, the river froze at the edges, and breath became visible in every exhale. Father Jimmy's collar now poked out from beneath a heavy wool coat, and his fingers were often tucked deep into gloves as he made his way from shelter to chapel, from bench to bench. The work never slowed, but Jimmy's heart had learned to move at God's pace, slow enough to notice pain, fast enough to respond. One morning, as he was leaving the cathedral after early Mass, a teenage girl was waiting at the steps. She looked no older than 15, trembling in the cold, clutching a drawstring bag to her chest. "Your father, Jimmy?" she asked. "Yes," he said, stepping closer. "What's your name?" "Lena." Her voice cracked on the second syllable. "I don't know where else to go," she whispered. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Come inside, let's get you warm." They sat in the sacristy, sharing tea and silence. Eventually, she opened up. Her stepfather had been abusive. Her mother didn't believe her. She'd run away 2 nights earlier and had been sleeping behind a laundromat. Jimmy listened carefully, then gently asked, "Do you want to be safe?" Lena nodded fiercely. "I know where we can start," he said. He brought her to a trusted youth shelter connected to the bench network. Within hours, she had a warm bed, clean clothes, and a counselor. Sierra came by that evening to check on her. "She's strong," Sierra said after the visit. "She reminds me of me." Jimmy smiled. "She's not alone anymore." Later that week, Lena drew a picture of the cathedral steps, snow swirling, her small figure on the stairs, and a figure reaching out with a hand. At the top, she'd written, "He didn't ask why, he just opened the door." Jimmy pinned it to the bulletin board above his desk. More stories poured in that winter. A man who'd once spit at Jimmy on the street came to confession and wept like a child. A nurse at a local hospital asked to be baptized after seeing Jimmy pray with the dying. A former addict, now sober, returned to thank him for the Bible he'd handed out a year ago. Jimmy remained unchanged by praise. For every story of healing, he remembered the ones who hadn't made it. Every joy was tempered with holy sorrow, a balance he carried like a quiet cross. Robert, still recovering but stronger each week, resumed limited duties. He and Jimmy began recording a podcast together, something simple and unpolished called The Bench and the Bishop. It featured conversations about mercy, street ministry, theology, and stories from the margins. Listeners loved it, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. One episode, Jimmy told the story of Raymond again, this time slower, with more space between the words. He used to say the sidewalk had memory, Jimmy said, that it remembered everyone who'd cried on it. And now, when I walk those streets, I think he was right. Holiness leaves a mark. Robert added, and sometimes, the holiest places aren't churches. They're benches with footprints beneath them. That quote went viral. T-shirts were made. A mural was painted on a downtown wall with the words in gold letters. But Jimmy didn't pay attention to any of it. He spent his days holding hands, making eye contact, sitting without hurrying. One Thursday evening, during the river prayer circle, the wind cut sharp and cold. Attendance was thinner than usual. But Jimmy stood, Bible in hand, and spoke softly to the few gathered. Jesus didn't promise comfort. He promised presence. And that's better, because presence endures even when everything else falls apart. After prayer, he noticed a man sitting on the outskirts. New, silent, thin. Jimmy approached. "Want to sit with me?" The man didn't speak, but he nodded. They sat together in the cold for nearly 20 minutes without a word. Finally, the man whispered, "I haven't spoken to anyone in 3 weeks." Jimmy said, "You just did." The man exhaled, tears streaming down his cheeks. 2 weeks later, that same man entered a shelter. 3 weeks after that, he was clean. And 4 weeks after he asked to be baptized, Jimmy baptized him during Sunday Mass at the cathedral. The pews were full. The choir sang "Amazing Grace," and Robert, standing in the back with a cane, smiled through tears. "Another one found," he whispered to himself. By the end of winter, the bench network was present in 30 cities. The model remained simple: one bench, one heart willing to sit, and a spirit ready to stay. Volunteers called it the Quiet Revolution. Jimmy didn't see it that way. "It's not a revolution," he said once. "It's a return, back to the way Jesus did it, one person at a time." He was asked to speak at a national youth conference that March. Over 10,000 teens packed an arena. Lights, music, cheers, it was a world away from the street. But when Jimmy took the stage, he didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I don't have a speech. I have a bench. And if you're hurting, confused, lost or angry, come sit. I'll be here." After his talk, hundreds came down to the floor. Not for autographs, not for selfies, but for hugs, conversations, silence. And Jimmy sat, for hours, until the last teen had left. Later, backstage, a youth leader approached. "You're exhausting yourself," she said gently. "You don't have to give so much." Jimmy looked at her, tired but peaceful. "I do," he said, "because I was once the one everyone passed by. And now, I'm the one who stays." The spring thaw came earlier than expected, and with it, new life burst into the city. Buds on trees, laughter in parks, and more feet walking toward the benches. For Father Jimmy, this season wasn't just about renewal. It was a reminder that resurrection is not a one-time event, but a rhythm that pulses through every soul willing to be found. He continued his quiet work. Weddings for couples who had met at the shelter, funerals for those who'd slipped away without family, baptisms in community centers, blessings in back alleys, confessions on church steps at midnight. There was no place Jimmy wouldn't go if it meant one more heart might feel held. One evening, after finishing a late hospital visit, Jimmy returned to the cathedral courtyard. The moonlight spilled across the old stone, bathing the bench in silver. He walked over, as he always did, and sat down. It was empty beside him, but he wasn't alone. He closed his eyes and whispered, "You're still here, aren't you?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, thick with presence. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was Andre. The same boy from months ago, now taller, more filled out, his eyes brighter. "Can I sit?" he asked. Jimmy smiled. "Always." They sat in silence for a while. Then Andre said, "I've been thinking about joining the bench network." Jimmy turned to him. "Why?" "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible. And now that I'm not, I think I want to help others feel seen too." Jimmy nodded, heart full. "Then you're already ready." Andre grinned. "Think I could wear one of those pins? The I sit ones?" Jimmy reached into his coat pocket and pulled one out. "I've been saving this," he said. "Didn't know for who, but now I do." Andre took the pin and clipped it to his hoodie. And just like that, another sitter was born. The next few weeks passed in a peaceful blur. Jimmy resumed writing again, this time more personal. A journal of stories, prayers, street memories, and quiet moments. He didn't plan to publish it. It was just for him. And for God. He titled it, "Things I've Learned While Sitting Still." In it, he wrote lines like, "Healing doesn't shout. It whispers until we're brave enough to listen. Grace isn't deserved, it's discovered. A bench is the most sacred altar I've ever known." Robert, now nearly recovered, began speaking in public again. He delivered a homily one Sunday about the church's future. "We don't need louder voices," he said. "We need deeper roots. And those roots begin in places like the shelter, the sidewalk, and the seat beside a stranger." After Mass, he and Jimmy stood outside greeting parishioners. A woman in her 60s approached them, weeping. "I lost my son to addiction last year," she said. "But hearing you both today, it gave me peace. It made me believe he wasn't forgotten." Jimmy held her hand. "He wasn't. He never was. But Later, as they sat together in Robert's study, sipping tea, the bishop looked at Jimmy with a distant expression. "You know," he said, "one day I won't be doing this anymore." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "You planning on disappearing?" Robert chuckled. "No, but time has its own rhythm, and when I step aside, I think I already know who should take my place." Jimmy shook his head, laughing. "No way. I'm a street priest. I belong on benches, not in offices." Robert's face turned serious. "Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who never asked for the seat. You carry the people, Jimmy. You carry the pain, the hope, the truth. And more than anything, you know how to stay." Jimmy didn't reply. He just looked out the window. The truth felt too heavy to hold, but also strangely right. Still, he said nothing. That week, Jimmy visited a high school where he'd been invited to speak. He didn't bring a speech, just a question. What would change if we all sat with someone different than us once a week? Students stared in silence. Then one raised her hand and said, "I think the world would feel smaller, but also safer." Jimmy nodded. "Exactly." As the school bell rang and the students filed out, the principal pulled him aside. "You're planting something in them," she said. Jimmy replied, "They're already rooted. I'm just reminding them." Back in the city, benches were being painted in bold colors with verses and quotes. One had "Stay with me" written in 7 languages. Another had a mural of Jesus washing feet, except the feet were worn sneakers and the water bowl was a coffee cup. Jimmy visited each bench when he could. He'd sit, listen, pray. Sometimes he left behind a note. Sometimes he picked one up. The movement was no longer his, and that was the greatest joy of all. He'd lit a match. Now others carried the flame. And wherever someone sat beside the hurting, the lost, the forgotten, the flame spread, without fanfare, without applause, just presence, just grace, one bench at a time. It was a quiet morning when the call came. Jimmy had just finished celebrating early mass in the shelter chapel when his phone buzzed. The number was familiar. Robert's assistant. He answered quickly, expecting a casual check-in, but the voice on the other end was trembling. "It's Bishop Barron," she said. "He passed in his sleep last night." Jimmy sat down. The words echoed in his ears, each syllable like a distant bell ringing through mist. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Tears filled his eyes as the chapel fell into stillness around him. He had seen death many times, held hands as breath slipped away, offered final blessings on cold beds. But this was different. This was the man who sat with him when the world passed him by. This was the one who believed. Later that day, Jimmy walked alone to the bench, the original one. He placed a cup of coffee on the left side, right where Robert always sat. And then he sat on the right. The silence was thick with grief, but also with gratitude. "Thank you," Jimmy whispered, "for stopping, for staying, for sending me forward." The funeral was held at the cathedral. Thousands came, clergy, lay people, politicians, the poor, the wealthy, the hidden, the seen. Every pew was filled. The front rows were occupied by shelter residents, former addicts, and volunteers of the Bench Network. No one was turned away. The casket rested before the altar, simple and dignified. Jimmy presided over the funeral mass. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but he did it with reverence, with tears, and with the same quiet authority Robert had once carried. He was more than a bishop, Jimmy said in his homily. He was a man who sat, a man who saw, a man who believed the gospel only made sense when your hands were dirty and your heart was open. He paused, voice cracking. "And because he sat with me, I now stand here today." After the Mass, the procession moved slowly through the city to the burial site. The streets were lined with people. Some held candles, others held signs. "Thank you, Bishop." He saw me. The grave was in a small, serene cemetery just outside the city. Before they lowered the casket, Jimmy knelt beside it and placed something inside. It was the wooden cross Raymond had carved, and Robert's scarf, the one he'd given Jimmy that first night. A circle, now complete. That evening, Jimmy returned once more to the bench. This time, a child sat there. A boy no older than 9, swinging his legs. He looked up at Jimmy curiously. "You Father Jimmy?" Jimmy nodded. "I am. My mom says you're the one who talks to people no one else wants to talk to." Jimmy smiled. "She's right." The boy scooted over. "Can I sit here?" "You already are," Jimmy said, settling beside him. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. The bench was enough. The next day, Jimmy visited Robert's study, now quiet and still. He ran his hand along the desk, saw the half-finished manuscript Robert had been writing. Ministry in motion. Jimmy took the pages and promised himself he'd finish it. Not with theories, but with footsteps. The bench network continued without pause. It became a legacy, not of one man, but of many. A movement of sitters, listeners, blessers, people who chose to stop instead of walk past, people who believed the sacred could be found on splintered wood and worn cement. Years passed. Jimmy aged with grace. His hair turned gray, his steps slowed, but his presence never wavered. He was still there, on Thursdays by the river, on benches in the bitter cold, in hospital rooms and shelters, in forgotten alleyways and sacred silences. One day, a young priest approached him after Mass. "I became a priest because of you," he said. "Not because of your story, but because of how you stayed." Jimmy looked at him, eyes full of peace. "Then stay for someone else." When the day finally came for Jimmy to lay down his own stole for the last time, it was quiet. He had requested no fanfare, no titles, just a bench, a place, a memory, a beginning. His funeral mass was celebrated at the cathedral he once thought he'd never enter again. The presider was the young priest he had once mentored. At the end of the homily, the priest said, "Father Jimmy didn't just walk in Christ's footsteps. He built paths for the rest of us, one bench at a time." The procession afterward stopped briefly by the original bench. It had been polished that morning. Flowers lined its edges. A new plaque had been added. It read, "In memory of Father James O'Malley. He sat, he stayed, he loved, so others could rise." People sat there for hours that day. Some prayed, some cried, some just stayed, because by then, everyone knew. The holiest place in the city wasn't the altar. It was the bench where love refused to pass by. And from that simple seat, a kingdom had come. And if you made it to the end of this story, maybe it's because something in it stirred your heart. Maybe, like Bishop Robert Barron, you've been walking past too many people for too long. Maybe, like Father Jimmy, you know what it feels like to be invisible, forgotten, or lost. Or maybe, just maybe, you're somewhere in between. This story isn't just about a man on a bench. It's not just about a bishop, or a priest, or a miracle of friendship and grace. It's about all of us. Because every day, in every city, in every life, there are benches waiting. Places where someone is sitting alone, hoping, not always for money or answers, but for someone to notice, to stop, to stay. What if that someone is you? What if the most powerful thing you can offer the world isn't a sermon or a solution, but your presence? What if healing begins not with answers, but with silence and coffee shared in the cold? Bishop Barron sat down, not knowing what would come next. Father Jimmy stood up because someone believed in him, and together they proved that when love stops walking and starts sitting, lives can be saved. So if this story moved you, don't just click away. Do something. Look around your neighborhood. Start with one person, one conversation, one moment of eye contact. You don't need a program. You don't need a title. You just need a heart that says, "I won't walk past you." Because that's where God lives, not in the spotlight, but on the bench. Not in grand gestures, but in quiet love. And if you're the one sitting on the bench right now, tired, ashamed, or forgotten, know this: God sees you, we see you, and your story is not over. So today, we invite you. Be the one who sits, be the one who stays, be the one who believes again. And if this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and leave a comment below. We read every single one. Because maybe, just maybe, your story is the next one that needs to be told. God bless you, and may you always find and offer sacred space, even if it's just a bench.